Right. Hello, so welcome to our introduction on solar for your home. There's a couple of minutes to go, so I'm just going to let some people tune in. But the way that this will work is it's basically a 45-minute or so presentation. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes of questions right at the very end as well. Because essentially we'll work through the presentation and you have a chance for questions. So what I'm hoping is that you'll have a slot to basically type in any questions. So if you come up with an idea for questions, what I'm hoping is that we'll answer that through the presentation. And then at the end, I'll read out the questions and then we can sort of stay as long as we want to sort of get through those questions. But basically, otherwise, I'm just hoping you can hear me okay. It's always a bit strange doing this on Zoom compared to in person. So if at any point there's any issues with sound or picture or anything, just drop me a message. And of course, if anything drops out, then we'll just pick up whenever, really. But yeah, otherwise, welcome. So thanks very much for joining me. What I will do is I will just bring up the screen for sharing. And we'll get straight on with the presentation. So if you bear me 1 minute. We'll get there. Right, bear me 1 moment. Zoom's just having an issue finding the right screen. Here we go. Perfect. Right, so hopefully everyone can see that okay. So once again, my name's Mark. So I've been with Spirit for about 4 years. And basically we're a local solar PV installer. So we install mostly solar panels and battery storage systems, both for domestic and commercial properties. So the way that the talk's going to work is we'll do a very brief bit about the company. We'll look at sort of the whole energy market as a whole, as to where's the UK at really, what the government intentions, exactly how does PV and battery storage work, what's the cost, what's the process, how do you get it on your house, is it worth doing? We'll have a brief look at products and warranties, what you can get on the market today, and then any sort of monitoring maintenance. We'll round it off with a little bit on electric vehicle charging points, and then we'll look at some battery storage points, and then the sort of bottom line on, is it actually green to get solar power, and how sustainable is it? So a little bit about our company. So we've been around 10 years. We had our 10th birthday back in February this year. About 25 people or so. We're all in-house. As I said, we do solar PV, battery storage, and EV charging. Roughly about 40% of what we do is at a domestic level, and then the other 60% will be commercial. And we work with both contractors, so that would be new build properties, but also commercial end users. So it might be a company that owns a building and is looking to reduce their carbon output. So we've done thousands of installations all the time that we've been around for the past 10 years, and we move along with the technology. So what's quite interesting about solar and PV is that the technology is moving on all the time. So what we're installing or what's top of the market now, in 2 years' time will be very different. It's a little bit like phones and computers, where the progress really does just keep moving on and marching on, particularly as more countries get involved, and particularly as China's entered the market, the cost really has fallen quite significantly. So our mission is really just to offer expert advice on installations and make sure that we install the most cost-effective systems as efficiently and effectively as possible. And what we really pride ourselves on are technical excellence, so knowing the detail, making sure what we install is right for you. We always put health and safety first, and it's just making sure that you're happy with the installation that you get as well, and it's right for your needs. So depending on what your usage is, depending what your priorities are, sometimes a huge installation might make sense, sometimes it might be something a bit smaller, and we really pride ourselves on just making sure that what we get is right for you. So heading to the whole kind of energy market in the UK, there's 3 issues for the next few decades that any government's going to have to deal with, and that's affordability. So we all know that the cost of energy is increasing over the next 10 years or so, We expect it to increase. I mean, in the past 10 years, it's gone up quite significantly. I'm sure we've all noticed that on bills. There's sustainability, so that's become a huge issue all of a sudden out of nowhere. We can't keep burning fossil fuels. The government's pledged to go net neutral by 2050. So the grid's going to have to be significantly more sustainable. And then there's security of supply as well. So looking at, is the investment that we make in, say, nuclear, is that still going to be around in 20 or 30 years' time? Same question for if we do go down wind and solar or whatever, or if it's just buying energy from the EU, is that going to be sustainable? Is that so secure, or are we actually creating a few problems by sort of going 100% renewable? So they're quite big issues, and one of the big problems that we've got is our grid is mostly based on fossil fuels at the moment. So that needs to change, and it's quite contentious that where that's going to go, and really how we're going to keep this peak demand level going. So this is, I think this is a few years old, this graph, but it's basically saying the problem is there's no clear path from the government yet on how they're going to keep the grid powering at peak demand, particularly if we're all expected to start driving electric cars and heat pumps, and the grid consumption is going to go up quite significantly. We're going to have to find that extra energy from somewhere. So this is a little pie chart on what the government has done so far. You can see we've actually made quite good progress in terms of renewables. So the big difference in 9-ish or so years is that coal has decreased hugely. So we've pretty much switched off coal. Gas is still the majority of where the energy comes from on the UK grid. Of course, this is going to change from day to day. So solar obviously only generates when it's sunny. So this is a kind of average over the years. But essentially the bottom line is coal has fallen hugely. We've really relied on gas to kind of keep everything going okay. But there has been a little bit of a revolution in renewables. So we've got solar was non-existent back in 2010, but it tied in with that as well. Wind is actually very impressive as well. This is that little slice at the top here. And now it's almost second in terms of generation, that we're second place in terms of generation. Again, these are averages. I wouldn't read too much into them, because obviously some days you're going to have lots of wind generation, other days you might not have any. So your grid needs to be diverse. You need to have, this big slice of nuclear generally where we're at today. You couldn't just get rid of this overnight, otherwise we'd have huge supply problems. And the other thing going forwards is with electric cars and heat pumps, we're going to have huge problems in basically getting more energy. The amount of energy that petrol, diesel, gas have in them is huge, and we're moving all of that onto the grid, onto the electric grid, and that electricity is going to have to come from somewhere. And I don't think anyone's really answered the question on where that's coming from at the moment. I know this government's been quite big on wind, but really the amount of energy we're talking about, there'll have to be a huge change in our usage habits and how the energy is generated. So we've got this other issue with the grid, that we're just trying to keep things balanced. So the grid operates roughly at 50 hertz. So what you're really trying to do is eliminate the problem of any supply issues in the future. So as our consumption increases, we just want to make sure that there's going to be enough energy to go around. And we think the solution to that is really using less, generate more locally, and also storing locally as well in terms of virtual power plants. So particularly battery storage is something we think will emerge as we all start to get electric cars. But at the moment it's quite new, it's quite small scale, no one really knows too much about it, and it's not really spoken about a great deal. It's all about reducing carbon, but at sort of what price is a little bit unclear. I just think there's normally quite just a big misunderstanding on the amount of energy and how the grid works, really. So for what the government has definitely told us, they have said we're all going to be buying electric cars from at least 2035. That's rumoured to be brought forward to 2032, or it might be 2030. So that's always changing. They did change it from 2040 to 2035 back in, I think it was February or so this year. So that's going to be a huge change for all of us if that is forced upon us, because again, I think one misconception is just the amount of energy that electric cars use is huge. For your average house, even if you have an average mileage of 10 or 20 miles a day commuting to work there and back, you're looking at roughly doubling your annual electricity consumption if you've got a bill or usage of around 4,000 kilowatt hours a year or something. So if every country in the every household in the country is going to be charging an electric car around about 5 o'clock when they come back from work, and they're doubling their annual consumption, there's huge problems on the grid. So this is a really big problem that the government's going to have to figure out, is where's that energy coming from, and how are they going to make sure there aren't blackouts or brownouts when there's not enough energy in the grid because there hasn't been enough investment. So it's something that any government going forward is going to have to figure out. It's really, electric vehicles is the one area that we know the government is intent on pressing forwards with. It's the only investment that you get at the moment. So there were quite generous grants for solar. They've all gone now. They went back in 2019. So it's the OLEV grant, or it's £350 off the installation cost of a charge point, is really all you get, other than a reduced VAT rate on solar. And the other element we've got is local government. So London's very much leading the way in trying to improve air quality and trying to decrease the amount of pollution that there is and carbon. What I personally think we'll find is that as towns like London and others follow, so Bristol was in the news a few months ago as well, as they start to get rid of petrol or diesel cars or ban them in city centres, you'll suddenly find that the market starts to skew over to electric cars. And if you buy a diesel car and you're not allowed to drive that in London or Bristol, a big part of having a car is suddenly gone. So I think local government will really help push the drive, as well as national government sort of forcing it upon us. But I think if your town and you live in that town suddenly says, sorry, or Reading, for example, if they say city centre can't have any petrol or diesel cars, it's going to really change your mindset towards owning a petrol or diesel car. The good news is that the government have at least halted fracking. So we're not expecting any more shale gas projects in the UK, which personally I think is fantastic news. And we declared a climate emergency. We're trying to go net zero by 2050. I think we'll just have to wait and see if that actually results in actions, because the amount of effort to achieve net zero by 2050 is a mammoth task. It is absolutely huge. And from what we're seeing at the moment, it's completely unattainable. I think there's no way that we're on the way to net zero by 2050 just from the sort of government incentives we've got at the moment. I think we're well off that. I hope I'm wrong, I really do, and I hope that we do see that, and I really hope that we start to see stronger legislation really encouraging people the right way rather than just penalising. But I think we'll have to wait and see. But that is a pledge that was put forward by Theresa May, wasn't it, a year or two ago. So we'll see where it takes us. And then worldwide, really, from sort of this point on, we'll focus more on solar. So solar, the big thing to note is it's fallen in cost hugely in the last 10 years. So as the manufacturing has moved to China, the cost of the kit has decreased by around 25%. Well, actually, it's not 25, it's more around 90% or so, the cost of the systems. So the cell efficiency has improved around 25%. It's probably a little bit more than that. So what we find now is that back in 2010, 2015, when you installed a system, you needed the government grants for it to really make sense and take the risk on it, where nowadays you don't need those grants because the cost of the systems come down so much. And solar's taking off in so many countries, particularly in obviously countries that are a lot sunnier than the UK. So if you get large-scale solar in the right country, such as Saudi Arabia, you can almost get it down to about 2.34 cents per kilowatt hour, which I think at one point was the cheapest rate that you could get electricity at. But tied in with that as well, we've got battery storage. So Tesla are really pushing the way on battery storage. They've announced their gigafactory. I think it's the one in Berlin that they're building now, and there's one in China as well. And really, they're pushing away on integrating battery storage into it as well. They're well ahead on many other electric car companies, and I think we'll just start seeing more and more companies involved in battery storage, because it's really one of the only ways that we're going to achieve this levelling out of the grid and making sure there's not peak demand all at the same time that we just can't cope with, particularly if we're reliant a lot more on renewable technology. Vehicle to grid is on the horizon as well. We'll talk about that a bit later on, but that's essentially drawing energy from the electric car that's parked on your drive. So taking a quick overview of a system, just before we get right into it, there are some key definitions that, again, it's never nice to start with these quite boring looking acronyms, but kW is kilowatts. So kilowatts is really the instantaneous power rate. So it's a nice way to think of this is either in terms of solar PV or perhaps in terms of like a fan heater. So if you've got one of those electric fan heaters that you might have in your room on at the moment, a 1 kilowatt fan heater will draw 1 kilowatt from the grid at that moment in time. So if you turn it on, it draws 1 kilowatt. If you have that on for 1 hour, that will use 1 kilowatt hour of energy. And these are key definitions because that's the way that we can measure and compare solar PV systems, because obviously solar makes energy. So if you have a 1 kilowatt peak system, which would be say 4 panels of 250 watts, that would create a 1 kilowatt peak system that would then generate 1 kilowatt in great perfect conditions when it's nice and sunny and cool. And in an hour of those perfect lab conditions, you'll generate 1 kilowatt hour. So they're all very confusing. They all look exactly the same, but they're quite important differences just because of the way that these terms interact with each other. So how does a PV system work? Essentially, the sun will shine on a panel. They'll only obviously generate when it's sunny. That will shine on the panel. That activates the cells in the panel to create DC electricity. That will run to your inverter, which swaps DC energy to AC energy. That runs into your generation meter, which measures what is produced, and that runs into your house distribution board. So the distribution board is kind of your fuse box. It's got loads of different names. It's where when your power trips or something's gone, you go to that panel and flip the switch just to make sure nothing's tripped, or if it is actually a power cut going on. So that's where all your breakers are and all your different circuits. The system will generally just run to that board. And then from that board, that excess energy that's been created will either power your on-site loads. So if you turn a light on or switch the dishwasher or washing machine on when it's sunny, you will not draw from the grid, you will draw from your solar panels. If there are no loads, then your solar will send that extra energy back to the grid. And if you aren't producing enough energy or it's nighttime, you'll just draw from the grid as normal. So what the system is doing is making sure you do not draw from the grid unless you have to, which is essentially when there is no production. But your devices in your house is always the first point of call for any solar energy. You can integrate a battery into this as well. And what that will do is it will allow the excess energy, rather than being sent to the grid, to run into your battery. And then you can draw from the battery later on in the day when there's a little bit more power. When there's less power from the solar, or no power at all, but you're still not draining from the grid. So that way you'll maximize your own use of your own energy, and you won't draw from the grid unless you absolutely have to. Then tied in with battery storage, you can also have power cut protection. So quite an important point is just with solar, you do not have power cut protection, because if the grid goes and your system is producing and sends that energy back to the grid, then whoever's working on the grid is going to get electrocuted because they won't realize that your system's activated. So what it means is when there's a power cut, the inverter will detect there's no incoming power and it will switch the system off. So if you want power cut protection, you need to have a battery, and that would be something like the Tesla Powerwall, which would protect your house load. So all the key smaller loads like lights, computers, burglar alarm, things like that would be protected. But non-backup loads would not be. So really big things like electric vehicle charging points, heat pumps, air conditioning would not be protected because they're just very intensive loads that would run the battery flat quite quickly. So the key financial benefits you get from solar are your bill savings, which was where you're drawing from the solar, not from your grid. So that means you get energy for essentially 0p, or what you paid, rather than 15p per kilowatts, which is kilowatt hour, which is roughly the average of what a domestic customer would pay. And then as well as that, when you send that energy back to the grid, if you're not using that energy, you can sell it back to the grid, which will be at roughly 5.5p per kilowatt hour. So if it depends on your supplier. So it used to be based on a government subsidy, that's all gone now. It really depends who you're with. So if you're with a government, if you're with a supplier such as Octopus, they'll pay you about 5.5p. They'll fit a smart meter and they'll just measure what your exported rate is. You can also do off-peak charging with a battery as well. So you could top up your battery at a night rate from midnight to 4 a.m. and then use that energy during the daytime, maybe when you've got an on-peak tariff of 20p or something. So that way you're using cheap energy. You just have to make sure that the size of your battery is appropriate for what your loads are, because you'd never want to dip into those on-peak bands. So in terms of the investment case, really, I mean, we get it quite a lot. There's a lot of people that are only interested in the investment case. And I think one important thing to state is that if that is the case, you've sort of missed the boat, because the feed-in tariff really gave a great payback. So what systems, it's not like it's not like it's a total white elephant. You will get a payback on the system. Generally, the system's expected to last 25 years for your solar, about 10 years or 10 to 15 years for the battery. And the ballpark payback will be around 10 to 20 years. And this depends a lot on what your roof layout is, where you are, what your tile type is, what sort of kit you go for. So if you go for the real cheapest possible kit, best straightforward installation, you'll get that about 10 years, might even come in about 8 or 9 years if you have a really high usage on site to use everything. If you go for the real best of the best kit and you want it to look a little bit nicer, all black panels in roof, you're starting to creep up more to this sort of 20-year payback. So it's quite a flexible value, but I think the important thing to know is really it's not about the payback anymore, but there is an element of that payback in the right circumstance, and about 10 to 20 years is a fair estimate. But really, without the feed-in tariff, you will struggle to get it much below about 10 or 12 years for a standard UK property. We've got a domestic online solar calculator which you can use. So you can go onto our website and just see roughly what that cost and payback is going to be. Of course, we can do quotes for you as well, which I'll run over on the process of. Roughly the cost of solar. So the average to look at is this 4 kilowatt one in the middle. That's what everyone knows as roughly the solar PV average in the UK. There are reasons for this, but really it's about 12 panels is the average. Ballpark cost, it's about £5,500 to up to £9,000 or so, and that depends hugely on your roof type. Slate tiles are more expensive than concrete tiles. The kit can be a lot more expensive as well. If you get the best of the best panels, you will pay a premium for those because they'll better warranties and better outputs. So that's your rough rule of thumb. I think a standard house would have 4 kilowatts. Each panel is about 1 meter by 1.7 meters. So normally you can even figure out roughly how many panels can fit on your own roof. But generally this is the most straightforward installation possible, where you just got 2 rows of panels, and that would certainly bring you more to sort of the £5,000 mark than it would if there's lots of independent panels all fitted around dormers and lots of different orientations. That's going to take you more towards the sort of £7,000, £8,000 or even £9,000 mark. The batteries are more expensive, so the Powerwall is about £7,500 plus VAT. It's newer technology. That's really why it's more expensive. The solar panels have been around a lot more. China's really driven down the cost. So battery storage is just newer technology, and it's more expensive at the moment. I'm sure that will creep down as electric cars get more common, because ultimately they're the same cells as what are in the electric cars at the moment. So we'll run through a quick process. This is just a kind of summary, but essentially we've got a sales process of just figuring out what's happening. And then there's the process of once you've decided to go ahead and you have paid a deposit and are interested how the process continues from there. So the very first thing that we do is just look on Google Maps for the roof. So we can normally assess if the roof is worthwhile considering just from the Google Maps. So even pre-site survey. So just looking at what's the space like, what's the orientation like, the tile type, all that. And generally, the more rectangular the roof, the better in terms of cost. And we can just make all these assessments with a quick chat on the phone or via email. So once we've had a chat, we'll find out what your priorities are. So why do you want solar PV? Is it all about the payback? In which case, it's probably not looking particularly great depending on your roof space. But if you just want to reduce bills, be more green, improve the EPC of the property, or tie in with an electric car to reduce your electric car bills, fuel bills. And then once we've sort of figured out what's important to you, we can help tailor the quote in the best possible way. That last point was quite important about if you're in an area of outstanding natural beauty. So on a pitched roof, you generally won't need planning permission, except if you're in an area of outstanding natural beauty facing the main road. Normally you would need planning permission, but a pitched roof it will all be under permitted development. Flat roofs usually need planning permission, so they tend to be trickier. So usually it's pitched roofs that you'll see in most 9 times out of 10 for installations in the UK. Once we've got all that information, we can put a quote together for you. Here's just a quick example for you. You get sort of payback estimates, estimates on self-consumption based on what your bill is as well. So that's quite important, just understanding what your usage is and how we can tie that together. And then we can do that with a PV battery and an electric vehicle charging point as well. So our quotes would include scaffolding as well. So when you're comparing quotes, what's important is to understand what kit they've quoted, and also that they've included the relevant planning or grid applications and also scaffolding. So sometimes some people can be a bit cheeky and not include scaffolding, which obviously is a part that you're going to need included on nearly every roof that's installed. From there, we can take it to a visit. So if you're interested and just want to find out a bit more, then we can come and measure up, have a quick chat about everything in more detail, look at the exact placement, take some measurements. And then once we have a final quote, you'll sign the order. So our payment normally is a 25% deposit. Then after that, installation is complete, then the remaining 75% would be payable. If it's a new build property, we've got a staged payment. So if you're building a brand new house and you want to put panels on, obviously the electrics are not going to be in for a few months. So there's a slightly different payment schedule. And of course, it would be done differently. So we wouldn't install everything on one day. It would be a little bit more stretched out. It's quite a wordy slide. The only thing you really need to understand from here is that the DNO permission is something you'll see a lot. And they're the people that look after the grid in between you and the power plant. So you have your supplier who bills you for your energy bill, and you can swap and change your supplier. You cannot change your DNO. So district network operator will be attached to your postcode or where you are. So generally in the south, so for Reading it's SSE, so Scottish and Southern Energy, UK Power Networks or Western Power Distribution are generally the three in the south that you'll encounter depending exactly where you live. The reason that we need to know about these is for a solar PV system that's above 3.68 kilowatts on the inverter, which is very common nowadays because people want larger systems, you will need to gain grid permission before installing, which we can do for you, but it means it's the first hurdle to overcome, and it's often sometimes a problem if they're not happy with the size of the system you want to install on that supply because it's not big enough. Then you can have issues with installing. Generally, they're okay with anything. Rule of thumb is up to about 6 kilowatts or so with a battery they'll be okay with, but it depends on the supply, it depends on the area. So really that's the only thing to bear in mind is that the grid will need to sign off on anything you want installed long before the installers are going to be on site and fitting those panels on the roof or installing the battery. And batteries will always need this permission if you have power cut protection as well. It's something we can do for you, but the thing to bear in mind is it can take up to 11 weeks to gain this permission. So if you have new build projects or you have projects where you need to get this in time, it's really the one area that is wise to get in the calendar quite early, and everything else can be sorted in due course. So the two different types of roof we can have, so there's sloping roof or flat roof. I did mention the flat roofs need planning permission usually because they'll come up more than 200 millimeters from the roof edge. They tend to be better for commercial roofs. They're not that great for domestic because domestic roofs won't be strong enough to support the weight of these concrete lintels that sit underneath the panels as well, where your sloping roof will have a lot better permitted development rights, so it's a lot easier to install as long as your building's not listed. For your structural sign-off, it's something we'll check, but before they're installed, we'll obviously check that the roof can take the weight. So generally, if there is a problem, you'll end up going with an in-roof system, which looks a little bit like this, where you do away with the tiles underneath. It's a bit more expensive, but it looks better. Where on a standard truss roof, it's quite unlikely that the roof would fail, so it doesn't tend to be a problem. Within the quotes, you'll have performance estimates as well, so there'll be an idea of roughly how much you're going to produce. It's really just dependent on orientation. So this is a nice summary of what you produce in a day. So this would be the nice perfect bell curve. And then this is what you produce each month. So you can see that the peak production month actually in April, May, so in spring. And the reason for that is that solar panels work when it's nice and cold. So you want a nice, clear, sunny, cold day, and that is when you get your best production. They don't like it when it's very, very hot, which is why you get this dip. So this must have been a very hot June. So the solar cells will work a bit less efficiently if it's hotter. But this is the nice generation peak that you get, and then these dips are where cloud cover has come out over the top, or there might be a bit of shade or something on the system. So generally you want a nice unshaded roof, nice clear cold sunny day, and that's when you get your peak production value. And 1 kilowatt peak generates in the region of between 750 or 1,000 kilowatt hours a year. Depends on location, tilt, orientation, and shading as well. Your postcode will really dictate what the estimate is. So we're all governed by NCS, which will tell you what your estimated output in your postcode is. This will all be within the quotation, and it's just saying south facing about 30 to 40 degrees will give you your best possible output in the UK averaged over the year. If you're east or west facing, it will be about 20% less. So it's still worth considering. North facing is not really worth installing solar panels on. And generally speaking, all these custom mounts where you can lift the panels a little bit higher, a little bit lower off the roof face, they're all really not worth it at the moment because they're too expensive. And for the sake of an extra 4 or 9% of production, it's not worth the cost to do. So generally you're accepting the roof pitch that you have, you're fitting the panel as best you can towards south, but it's always going to be a compromise unless you're building a house brand new from scratch. So we're looking for south facing roofs generally, but if you do have an east or west facing roof, your production is going to be focused more into morning or evening, which sometimes works better if you know that you always work at home in mornings, then you're going to be able to consume that energy better if you're not getting that battery fitted. Lots of numbers and figures. Again, this will be in our quotes. It'll also be on the online calculator that we can provide to you. So it's just a slide with all the sort of figures that you can pour through if you do end up getting a quote from us. We can also put some estimates on shading. So if you have a big old oak tree near the roof that you're worried about, we can model what the estimated drop in production is and if it's still worth installing or not. That's with a software called PV Sol that we use. And it'll just estimate and say, it's not worth putting the panels, say, in this bottom corner, we should put them in the far top left corner, and it'll put a quantitative figure on what that shading reduction will be. As part of just before the installation, we do the technical survey as well, which is just checking that your earthing and bonding's up to standard. So it's our electrician just verifying that everything's okay, answering any questions, just making sure that the roof does take the weight. And when we've got all the planning, so the planning, structural sign-off, and local grid application sorted, you'll get an installation date. And that installation will take around 1 to 3 days, depending on the size of the installation. Here's an example. So you get the scaffolding goes up about 3 days before or a week before. That'll be up for a week or two. And then the installation itself will take, usually it's around 1 day. It'll be a couple of days. If it's slightly larger like this one, will probably be a couple of days. And then scaffolding comes down, it's all commissioned and everything's good to go. So here's some more examples of previous installations. So you've got, this is a standard on-roof clay tile system. This one's an in-roof system on a slate roof. This one's in-roof as well, and this one is a sort of custom design that's again in-roof. That was a new build property. But there's plenty of different options, and you can, as we'll see, there's lots of different panel types to try and match what the building looks like, or just really give the most cost-effective installation possible. This is an on-roof system. So most buildings, I would say, in the UK have these concrete tiles, these ridged concrete tiles, and that's the most cost-effective way to fit solar to. So yeah, that's another project done. And this was a new build development that we were involved with a house builder. So putting lots of individual panels on buildings. But yeah, if you've got a project or any questions or anything, just feel free to get in touch with us, really. So we'll have a look at the products and warranties. So obviously you've got solar panels. What is the difference between solar panels? Well, there's what they look like. So you can have all black, blue with silver frames. Really, at a domestic level, you'll be looking at these all black panels. There used to be quite a big cost difference between the two, but really there's not a huge difference and it'll look nicer. So most people tend to go with all black panels. The other things to consider are what is the output, what's the cell efficiency going to be, and what's the warranty. So the key thing to bear in mind is that the output is really limited by the inverter. So the inverter will give you a maximum energy output, and there's only so many solar panels you can have on that. So if you get a nice efficient panel, that's going to be paired with the inverter anyway. So what you're really buying is the warranty, which on the best panels will give you a better cell degradation warranty. They'll assure you that the cells will not degrade as much as a competitor's panel. So it'll be something like 94% of the original capacity will be held after 25 years rather than 80% or so for the top end panels. And you'll also get a 25-year product warranty instead of a 10-year product warranty. So really it's more about the warranty that you're buying into with the panels rather than anything else, and obviously the output. But The key thing to bear in mind is that the panels don't break very often. They're solid state and they'll degrade over time as they're out in the sun. But the part that will most likely fail if something's going to is the inverter, because that does the hard work of swapping DC to AC energy. So I'd never get an inverter with less than a 10-year product warranty. We offer a 5-year workmanship warranty on all our installations, but you've still got another 5 years of this product being covered. It's just the labour you'd need to pay for. And generally, you want that as close as possible to the panels to keep the DC cabling nice and short, which is a bit more expensive and for safety reasons as well. You'll have a generation meter as well. That just tracks what's being produced. It's a bit less important now the feed-in tariff is gone, but it basically just tallies what your production is over the life of the system. So if you think there's a problem on the system that's not generating, you can check that and see if it's ticking up. If it's not ticking up when it's nice and sunny, you know there's a problem. Then you can also get some more basic batteries. So I use the term battery quite loosely, but these are solar diverters. So if you've got that excess energy that's not being used on site and then it runs back to the grid, rather than running back to the grid, what you can ask it to do is run it to your immersion heater in the hot water tank, and that will give you free hot water rather than having to send that energy back to the grid and then pay to heat up the hot water with your immersion rod in the hot water tank. It's a little bit older technology because really with batteries, if you have a battery fitted, you wouldn't really get this fitted because most of the excess energy will run into the battery anyway. But your solar iBoost is one of them that you'll see. Eddy is another one as well that works with a Zappi, but there's a few competitors out there. But it's a good way to reduce your gas bill with your excess energy. It's a little bit less relevant with the feed-in tariff gone as well, because most of the time your supplier is going to be paying you for that excess energy. So if they pay you about 5p per kilowatt hour and gas costs in the region of 3 or 5p per kilowatt hour, there's not too many savings to be had. So I think it's more marginal. It can make sense in the right case. But generally, I think batteries, as battery technology takes off more, we'll probably be seeing less of these solar diverter units. So taking us on to the batteries, the Tesla Powerwall 2 is the most common battery that we install. That's what it looks like. So there's two components. There's a little gateway that sits by the incoming supply, and then the main battery unit essentially gives you up to 5 kilowatts of charge and discharge to use when you want. It gives you that power cut protection. So if your house is prone to power cuts, it'll let you keep that energy for use in your own while your neighbours are having a power cut. And it gives 13.5 kilowatt hours of storage. You can have up to 3 batteries per phase on your supply. So generally, most domestic properties will be single phase. You can have up to 3 of those. And it is a good battery. It's just a lot more expensive. So it won't make sense from a payback point of view generally, but it will give you a lot more grid independence. And really that's what batteries are about at the moment, is making sure that you're as independent as possible, you're immune from power cuts, and you're using as much of your own solar energy as possible without having to send that back to the grid. In terms of mounting, the panels are just fixed into the rafters with these brackets. So the brackets will be drilled into the rafters, and then you'll have the railing clipped on, and then the clamps will be clipped on, which hold the panel in place. That's a standard system for your pitched roof system. If it's a flat roof, it's either ballasted or it can be fixed into the roof as well. So this is an example of the ballasted system, where you either have that concrete that sits underneath and keeps it weighted down, or you can put fixings into the roof, which is a lot more expensive. Again, I think really at a domestic level, this would only be applicable on a new build. So if you're building a new big flat roof, that's really when these systems make sense. For retrofit, they're very tricky because you need that planning permission. It's quite frustrating. Maybe the government might change the planning rules, but at the moment, generally for a flat roof on domestic property, you will need planning permission. And often, if they've not been built with panels in mind, that roof is not going to be strong enough. So things like dormers and loft conversions it's a classic kind of mansard roof that you see in London. They're not going to be able to take the weight of the panels. In-roof systems, I mentioned a bit earlier, so they're where you do away with the tiles underneath and you just have the panels fixed directly to the battens. And it looks a lot neater. It's cheaper because you don't have to buy tiles and put them underneath the panels. And it's generally the best way to go for a new build. You might do it on a retrofit if the tiles are really tricky or it's a bit too difficult to work with that structure because it's too weak or the roof is too weak. But really, I mean, I think one of the biggest frustrations, and I hear it a lot from people, is why don't all new builds have solar panels? And I completely agree. I think because it costs too much is the answer. But it's really something the government should encourage, is any new build that goes up should have these integrated panels in. It makes perfect sense because everyone's on site at the moment. It's nice and cost effective, and you save money on that tiling, and it would reduce the carbon cost of that property for 25 years in the future. So why all new builds don't have this, I do not understand. Even people that absolutely resent the look of panels, and that's probably one of the biggest complaints that I get, is that people don't like the look of the panels. Even they will admit that in roof does look better, looks more like a skylight, and especially from the ground. This is another installation we did. It's a lot trickier to see them. They don't jump out as you, especially if it's an all black panel on a grey tile. So that's a kind of common frustration I hear is, yes, why are these not put on all new builds? It would be great. And it'd be a really good way just to reduce really the carbon cost of houses and the energy usage that we're all expected to draw in the future as we get electric cars. So there are a few more examples here. We've got, this is an in-roof system. You can integrate it with Velux windows as well. Usually you'll see that just one or two panels on new build properties. And the reason you see this is because the developers are usually ticking a box to make sure that they meet a minimum requirement to meet their basically building regs or SAP calculations to ensure that they've met the bare minimum requirement, which is a shame because they've gone through the effort of putting a system, and a few more panels would actually give a good size system. But a lot of the time it's just a little bit too small to actually really eat into those electric bills. You can also have a fully integrated system. So if you want to do away with the tiles completely, you can take the panel in right to the edge. It's quite a bit more expensive to do that, but it does look better. And then there's the fabled solar tiles, which they are around. You can see these little slightly shinier parts on this roof. The Tesla tiles are the ones that are probably most hyped, and they're not going to be here for another couple of years or so. They are trialing in America, but they are quite expensive, really. You can get solar tiles that are from competitors, so things like Seleco or GB Sol. They tend to be roughly about 4 or 5 times the cost of a standard equivalent sized PV system. So the only time you're ever really going to do this is when you have really strict planning consent or planning rules that do not allow solar panels, or it's entirely for aesthetic purposes that you want the panels. It's not going to make sense from a payback point of view ever, because the cost of the tiles is about 4 or 5 times what the solar panels, a traditional solar panel, would be. We can do ground mounted systems as well. So they are rarer, but they can happen for domestic systems. Normally you see them on sort of the motorway by the M4 on the really large field projects where essentially it was all based on the feed-in tariff. So the company would have rented that field and then got a good feed-in tariff payment, and then paid for that installation. Nowadays, it's all about usage. So as long as you've got high usage, let's say if you've got quite a big property with significant usage and lots of field space, you could install that. The thing to bear in mind is that the trenching is quite expensive. So wherever these panels are, they will need to run back to your house distribution board or incoming supply, which is normally quite expensive, and they will always need planning permission. So I think it's anything over 9 square meters on a ground mount will need planning permission. So that's another hurdle to get over, is once you've got the grid permission sorted, and then you've got planning, and you've sorted out the trenching, and you've got the cost sorted, then it will go ahead. But I think there's quite a lot of exclusions there that disqualify a lot of properties from installing a ground mounted system. But they can work. We have done a few over the years. And certainly if your usage is high enough, it can make sense to do. And especially if your roof is very old, if the panels aren't going to match the character of the property and your roofs are just very difficult to work with, it can be a more cost-effective way if that electricity bills are nice and high. So just touching on last bits of equipment. So we've got the solar edge system. So if you get lots of shading on the roof, rather than having a traditional string inverter, you can have a solar edge system, or a microinverter system is another option to go down. What it does is, if we've got these panels and one of these panels is shaded on a standard system, the other 2 will be held back to the least performing panel. And that's always a flaw with string inverters, is that shading really hampers the production. So if you do have a big oak tree that you just do not want to get rid of, and you want a solar as well, the best compromise is to install a system like Solar Edge, where it will put an optimizer under the panel, and it allows, if that one panel is shaded from some leaves, the other two panels will still perform to their maximum ability, so they will not be held back to that least performing panel. It's also slightly safer, and as it keeps everything to 1 volt DC if the optimizer is disconnected or if the inverter code turns off. And you do get better monitoring as well. So you can see at a panel level what each panel produces. Whereas string inverter will just tell you what the whole system produces. You don't get this nice map of what your panels are all producing. So what is the point of a battery? Essentially, the battery is going to let you store your excess energy. So it will protect you from power cuts. It will let you use as much of your own energy as possible. And it's going to let you charge up from the grid on a cheaper rate and use that energy during the daytime. So there are uses for the batteries. I think the eco argument is a little bit blurrier for batteries, because what we need to bear in mind is that if you're charging your battery from the grid at midnight hours and that energy is coming from a gas power plant, it's not particularly green. So really what we really want to make sure is that if we start to install more batteries and have more electric cars on the roads, the energy going into those batteries is green energy, not just deferred energy from fossil fuels that really has sort of defeated the purpose of installing the battery. But they will also help smooth out the variability in your day as well. So this graph sums it up quite nicely, which is most domestic properties, most of us, well, obviously it's a little bit different now, but we normally work from an office 9 to 5 each day. That's your standard usage pattern, which means you have this peak in the morning and this peak in the evening. And the midday peak is when your solar is going to generate. So the issue is you're out of the house when this generation hits. So if you have a battery, the battery can capture this excess energy and then move that over into the morning and evening peaks where you can use that energy. So generally, if you have a PV system on your roof, your on-site consumption without a battery is going to hover around 30–35%. If you're retired or you work at home all day, that could probably creep up to about 50 or 60% maximum. And then really you'd need the battery to get anywhere above that. So you're looking at greater than at least 70% on-site usage with the battery if you get that installed as well. So this slide is really these rates change all the time. So I think this was right when it was written, but there's a little bit of a change. Essentially, you can just get a cheaper night rate and then top the battery up with that lower night rate and then survive during the day on the peak rate. So you make sure that all your energy in the battery is at 7.91p, and then you're making sure that you never dip into this 41p band. But as long as the battery is sized right, that's nothing to worry about, and you'll have a nice cheap rate essentially, and a flat rate of just under 8p, which is quite attractive. It changes all the time. This is all moving very quickly. So I think do your homework definitely if it's something you're going to be looking at doing, because the rates do change quite significantly as the demands change as well. And you can even go as close as half-hourly rate as well with someone like Octopus, who will change the rate every half hour, and you can charge and try to sell the energy back from that battery as well. And Tesla will even offer you a Tesla plan through Octopus as well, which will give you a flat rate. I believe it's 11p flat rate charge discharge, and if you own a Tesla car, it's as low as 8p as well. So there's lots of really quite cutting edge stuff going on the energy supply side, which it's really returning to the days of that kind of Eco 7 tariff that many people might remember, or Eco 11, where you had a night rate tariff and a day rate tariff, and that will certainly come back as more people get electric cars. So final few bits, we've got monitoring and maintenance. It's always important just to keep an eye on the system. So this is obviously badly placed panels by dirt road. You want to clean them if they're this bad, but usually on a pitched roof, they'll be self-cleaning. They've got a hydrophobic coating on them, so the rain will do most of the work, but you could clean them every sort of 2 or 3 years if they look grubby. A window cleaner can do that for around £100 or so from the ground. You can electrically service the system. Generally, there's not a lot you need to do, because if you notice there's something wrong with the system, would you have to do something. So if you've noticed there's a problem where it's not generating, you can get it electrically serviced. If you just want to keep it ticking over and making sure it's producing as best as it can, it'll be about every 5 years or so, probably once before the warranty on the inverter's up, so at least I say just before a 10-year term. But generally, if it's working okay, I wouldn't worry too much about it. And in terms of monitoring, you just get lots of graphs of production over day, week, month, year. Your inverter and your battery would tell you that as well. So here's an example of that nice daily production on a day. That's, say, from this Solis inverter. And then your battery will give you a bit more detail on exactly what's being used, where that energy is going, what the consumption is, and then just your sort of live power flow as well, which is quite useful. So final couple of slides. Electric vehicle charging points, we're all probably going to get one. We all probably don't know a lot about them. Really, as I mentioned earlier, the only support you get is that £350 grant if you have an eligible electric vehicle with off-street parking. Rough cost for a charge point, the ones we install all are solar smart, so they will trickle charge direct from the solar to your car that's parked on the drive, which lets you use a little bit more energy and is a great way to basically improve that self-consumption value and the payback on your system. So ones such as the Zappi, which is this one here, and the Anderson, which is a nice neat one just on the left here, they'll generally be about 32 amps, so that's 7 kilowatt charge points on a single phase. If you've got 3-phase, you could go up to 22 kilowatts, but really most people will be stuck with either 1 or perhaps 2, depending on the size of your supply. If you've got a 100 amp supply or something. Takes about 2 to 8 weeks, depending on the DNO. So some DNOs are a lot better than others. SSE for Reading, particularly bad, very frustrating to work with sometimes. So they will be, it's about 8 weeks or so to get permission on electric vehicle charging point installation. And you can always retrofit these as well. So same goes for the battery. It's not like you have to get all of this at once. You can get the solar, see how it goes, fit the battery, and then fit the charge point later on as well, depending if you have the car as well. This is just a little bit more detail. So it's about £950 all in for this Zappi charge point, roughly the same ballpark for the Anderson and the LV as well. And you have different settings. So you can either just charge the car as quickly as you can with the charge point, or you could set it to your solar sort of eco modes to try and just use as much solar as possible and improve the amount of green energy that your car's using as well. We haven't quite got vehicle to grid charging, so at the moment you can only put the energy into the car. You cannot draw from the car at the moment. So it's something to keep an eye on. Nissan and OVO are doing trialing at the moment. I know Octopus with their Quasar charge points as well are trialing. So I think it will be the future, but at the moment, not quite. So you can only put the energy in. You cannot draw that energy and sell it back to the grid or use it in the house just yet. So final slide. Sustainability of solar PV. Really, the bottom line is solar is very good. We have taking everything into account, including manufacture, delivery, recycling. Solar has 1/10 the carbon footprint of gas per unit generated and 1/20 that of coal. And every solar panel will pay back its carbon cost, so the cost it costs to make that solar panel in 1 to 4 years. So you'll get at least 21 years of completely carbon-free electricity generation. So if there's one takeaway from this, it's any of those myths about how it actually takes more carbon to make a solar panel. Complete rubbish. It does not. It's very clean. It is a very good way to reduce carbon and create carbon-free electricity. Batteries are a little bit different. They're not going to produce the green energy, but they will store it. They'll allow the balancing of supply and demand across the grid, and they'll reduce the need for investments in fossil fuel power generation. So I think they're part of the solution, but it's a little bit more of a grey area because a lot of the materials that come from batteries, so such as cobalt, they will not be quite as eco-friendly as some of the other parts of, say, the PV production. So I think it's something to bear in mind is that battery technology is quite intensive and it's quite carbon intensive to make batteries, particularly with lithium-ion batteries where we're at the moment. And recycling is a big question mark as well. I think generally I've found recycling's been okay with lithium-ion batteries at the moment, but it does cost money at the moment. I think that's a worry for many people that buy electric cars in the future, is if they're left with a car that nobody wants, that might be an issue. But I think the market will adjust once they realise they can reuse those materials from the batteries. I don't think recycling is as much of a problem as I think people feel it is. And then, there's the option of using second-hand car batteries for home storage, which would be a great way to use older cars as well. So maybe when their capacity's fallen off, because car batteries are significantly larger than household batteries. Even your smaller, say, Nissan Leaf battery will be 27 or 50 kilowatt hours. the Powerwall was 13.5 kilowatt hours. So you could use an old Nissan Leaf and just leave that at home and use that battery. That might be a good way to reduce some of the carbon problems. Great, well, I think that's it from me. So if you've got any questions, feel free to chat away and ask in the chat box. Thank you for joining, really. If you have to tune out, thanks very much. I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, either just drop us an email. That's the email address is residential@spiritenergy.co.uk. Give us a call or whatever, really. But if you've got any questions or anything, do check our website as well. There's plenty of good material on there. But I hope you found it useful, and hopefully, we can help reduce our carbon output together. So yeah, I'll just double check. So I'll bring myself back up on the screen. I will double check if we have any questions. There we go. Right. Great. So first question, say, are the slides available for download? Yes, I can pass them to you. What I might do is we've got all your email addresses, so what we can do is just post a link either to a recording of this, or it will be to the presentation, so you've got a copy if you want to look over anything. Next question I've got is, how much is the Tesla Powerwall battery, and can they be fitted retrospectively to an existing PV system? Ours was installed in 2011-12. So yes, you can, absolutely. There's two ways you can fit a battery. So it's either AC coupled or DC coupled. If it's AC coupled, it means that your battery runs into the house board. If you have a DC coupled battery, that's where you share the same PV inverter. So you need to take out the PV inverter to install the battery. So generally on a new system, you'll have a DC coupled battery. It's probably slightly more a better way to go, but you can still do the AC coupled method. What that means is the Powerwall would go somewhere on the ground floor near your house distribution board, and the cost of the battery, it's roughly £7,500 plus VAT. It's a bit of a minefield on the VAT because it's 5% on solar, and it is sometimes 5% on the battery combined, as long as the total kit cost of the project is not above 60%. If it is above 60%, then the battery is 20%, but the solar would still generally be 5%, unless you are over 60, in which case everything's at 5%. So they are the strangest tax rules ever. They got brought in last year in October 2019, but it's a bit of a pain, really, because what we find is, in retrofitting a battery is always 20%. So it kind of penalises people that have had solar installed. But if you get a battery installed, it's always 20%, which makes no sense. What we're hoping is that maybe the government might change this. The reason they had to bring in these strange tax rules in the first place was because of there was EU rulings and things. So since we're leaving the EU, we'd like to hope that maybe that might change. But we'll see, really. I think it's another one we've just got to hope that the government makes some change on it. So I've been asked, Mike, you've mentioned a couple of times that solar panels only work when it's sunny. In our experience, that's not the case, as the panels also work when it's cloudy, as long as it's bright. Yes, that's a very fair point. So it's not that panels don't work when it's sunny. They will work the best when it is sunny. So the output on the system, you'll hit that peak output when it's sunny. If it's cloudy and really overcast, you will still generate something. So particularly if it's quite a bright overcast day, you'll get maybe sort of 30% of what a nice sunny day would produce. But what isn't great is that you'll have just reduced generation. So particularly on those cold winter days in December, when there's 6 hours of daylight, it's overcast and it's rainy, you're really going to struggle to get the same output as you would on a June day when there's 18 hours of daylight and it's nice and sunny, clear with no cloud cover. You're just going to generate a lot more. So I think it's something to consider that in the UK, the bulk of your production is always in summer, and it's also spring and autumn. But winter will have significantly less generation, unfortunately, because it's the UK. So yeah, it's a fair point. You will still generate something. And the nice thing about that is that even if you generate a small amount, that will keep your small loads going. So things like fridges and freezers are usually powered at midday, no matter the time of year, because even on a really overcast day, it'll still keep it going. Yeah, that's a fair point. So yes, you will generate something. It'll just be less, unfortunately. So I have been asked, can you explain more why when it is hot it works less well as we're going to have hotter and hotter weather. Would that be an issue? I can try. I think it might be a bit, without getting into too much detail, I think essentially you get more resistance as it's hotter. So when these cells are colder, you'll basically get a better output on the panel. I think that's about as good as I can explain it. I think the thing to bear in mind is it's really, it's those sort of 30, 35 degree days that you get where you will really notice the production will dip, because the cells just don't like being in that heat. The other issue we've got is that a lot of the time the sun the sun needs to be lined up nice and dead on to the panel to get the best output and the most amount of light. But obviously with that, you'll get a lot of heat as well. So what you tend to find is that it's just those clear, crisp, cold days that will just give you the best output. Unfortunately, I think there's not a lot you can do about it. You can have on-roof systems, which will give you better airflow underneath and help cool the panel slightly. It's really, I don't think it's a big thing to worry about in the UK, because most days, fortunately at the moment, are not 30, 35 degrees. I agree with you, it's a worry in the future. Of course, we're going to have hotter weather, but whether it negates the fact of going solar, I think that would be a silly reason not to buy solar panels. I think the other thing to bear in mind is you will still generate energy, so it's not as if it's going to be zero. That output might be reduced, say 10 or so %, so it's not vast. The in-roof system, where the panels are attached directly to the battens, so you don't have those tiles underneath, normally because you don't have that airflow, the panels will be slightly hotter, and that will give you an output. It's around 6 or 10% less generation over the year. So I think that's what we're talking about, is single digits of %, maybe touching on double. I don't think it's so big that it's just not even worth bothering. That's really putting a panel on a north face roof, which will give you about 50% less generation over the year, which wouldn't be worth it. So I think yes, it's worth considering. And if you've got an option of, do I put the panel on the north or south roof, or should I put panels on roof or in roof, you consider that. But I think it's, yeah, I think it's not something to be too worried about. Great. I think that is most questions. I'll just give it another minute or so, but we're pretty much bang on time. So yeah, thanks very much for tuning in. Again, I really hope you found that useful. Any questions at all, just let us know, but I can send an email around just with the details of that presentation. Any more questions, just let me know, whether they're related to solar, carbon, or whatever, really. Yeah, I think it's just for me to thank you once again for tuning in, and yeah, I hope you've well, really good Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.